For our final session of the morning, please welcome Ann Neuberger, Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University and Senior Advisor at SCSP, and Royal Hansen, Vice President of Privacy, Safety, and Security Engineering at Google, for a session on cyber and AI. The conversation will be moderated by David Sanger, National Security Correspondent for the New York Times.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be back up here. For those of you who were sick of hearing me moderate the last time, we've got another run. But I'm delighted to be here with Ann Neuberger and with Royal Hansen, as you've both heard. And we're going to be discussing how cybersecurity is affected by an era of AI. And just to set the stage here, and Ann, I guess we'll start with you on this. When you were Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, you ruined a lot of evenings dealing with Salt Typhoon and with Volt Typhoon, two very different kinds of hacks that China was involved in. One of them into infrastructure, one is a very sophisticated espionage operation inside the telecom network. What strikes me 4 or 5 months after you left office is they're still there. And so I'm wondering if you and then Royal can just give us a sense of what you expected when you first discovered these and why you think it's been such a persistent, difficult threat.
Absolutely. So first, it's great to be here with you, David. It's great to be here, as always, for an SCSP event. And I see folks saying that they can't hear me, but I presume the team in the back will help with that. So, you know what? A few years ago, the U.S. intelligence community said, we recognize and acknowledge that China has become a peer of the U.S. in terms from an espionage perspective, from an offensive cyber perspective. And what that translates to is recognizing that as a country, China has a sophisticated, well-resourced program aligned with their highest priorities. So as David put it, Salt Typhoon was essentially China using U.S. telecom companies as a signals intelligence system, right? Compromising U.S. telecoms. In some cases, they were in for over a year, at least, before they were detected. And having the capability to make an inline copy of every phone call. Phone calls in the U.S., when you're calling from a desk phone, aren't encrypted. And even from a cell phone, they're only encrypted if you're using an app on top of the actual cell call. Hi, is that better? Okay. I have to say that for somebody who served in the National Security Agency, having two recording devices on me is highly, highly uncomfortable in any event. So what China did was essentially turn the nation's telecoms into its signals intelligence system, being able to make copies of any phone call of interest, able to geolocate by using the nearest wireless tower U.S. individuals, where they were going, folks in the intelligence community, potentially individuals who the U.S. government was tracking as of interest to the Chinese government as well. Very highly concerning capability for a competitor and an adversary. And to your point, David, when we look at Volt Typhoon, China developed the capability to be pre-positioned in U.S. critical infrastructure, in water, in power, in pipelines. And you asked a critical question, which is, what did I expect in terms of what we would be able to detect and what combined U.S. government and private sector would be able to remove? And there is a key center to that question, which meant that I was not confident that the U.S. government could detect it or remove it in any persistent way. Why? Because there is an asymmetry between the U.S. and China. The United States, for reasons of law and policy and civil liberties protection, does not have any government monitoring of critical infrastructure held by the private sector, right? Our power, our pipelines, our water systems are generally owned by private companies. Those are not monitored by the government. And thus, their defense very much relies on private companies who are up against a nation-state, well-resourced, sophisticated actor. I actually think that's something we'll talk about a bit later, that we can use AI to fundamentally change. But that's what's made detection harder, and that's what's made removal of Chinese advanced capabilities in a persistent way so difficult, because in many cases, the critical companies operating our infrastructure don't necessarily have the resources or the skills to tackle that. And AI calls for us to have a new type of partnership to enable more rapid detection and defense.
We'll get to that in just a moment, but is your overall message here, Anne, that the people in this room, all hyper-connected, all using every form of communication device, should assume now that our ordinary telephone unencrypted systems are as vulnerable now as they were a year ago to the kind of Chinese activity you were thinking?
The telecoms are a high-value target for a country, right? Because all of our political communications, our corporate communications, our national security communications run on the nation's telecom networks. So you'll have the best intelligence services in the world trying to gain access to those systems. So it requires high-end cyber defense. And what we observed during the Salt Typhoon incident response was that in many cases the nation's telecom, in some cases, has excellent cybersecurity. In others, there's tech debt, there's older tech systems that frankly weren't built for the kind of offensive capabilities we see some of our national adversaries have.
Maybe. So Royal, let me ask you to jump in here, because your systems have been built for this, and probably Google does, I think, some of the best work in dealing with nation-state adversaries, both finding them and calling them out, in part because you so dominate in the Gmail sector and so forth. And yet, even in that example, you had a case with Google Calendar that you announced just last week that involved a Chinese state actor who got into it. And so tell us a little bit about how you're seeing the behavior change, and please pick up on anything that Anne said.
I was just, as Anne was talking, I'm reminded of our own experience in 2009 and 2010 with Chinese threat actors. This is Project Aurora, and really the wake of that was the beginning of what you've just described, David, in the sort of the approach to security at Google. We established our threat intelligence group in the wake of that. We established Project Zero, going after zero-day vulnerabilities.
Right.
But what's not always, and zero trust, the whole idea of beyond corp, that you wouldn't trust even your endpoints inside of the network. That's all born in the reaction to a similar attack, as Anne describes, aimed at critical communication infrastructure for the country and the globe.
To remind, 15 years ago.
15 years ago. And so, and one thing we'll get to, that's actually when we embedded a small AI team inside of our cybersecurity team to start seeing how we could use the technology to change the game. So it's not the first time we've seen this sophisticated level of attacker, and it's not the last time we'll see them.
Okay, so Royal, let me follow up with you on that, because a year and a half, 2 years ago, in fact, I think maybe even at the first national security exchange conversations we had here, I remember on this stage we were debating, does AI play to the offense or play to the defense? And some of your colleagues at Microsoft were making the argument, well, it's hard to know, but on balance, I think it probably helps the defender some more, because it evens the playing field to some degree, because the cost of entry was so low for offense prior to that. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, and we had our own version of this we called the defender's dilemma, which is you have this imbalance. Attacker has to be right all the time, attacker right once, defender has to be right all the time. AI is such a democratizing technology that everybody who uses it can get productivity gains. So the key, I think, to your question and to that, the balance, is if every good guy, so to speak, is a defender, then the improvement in the hygiene of our old technology and our legacy technology will get better faster than a smaller number of attackers using the same tools. But that's contingent upon us as defenders being great and power users of AI. We can't wait for it to land in our laps. We have to be users of the technology. And that means it's not just the cyber staff, it's the software developer. If the software developer can patch faster, that's a win for the defense.
So Anne, that, if you take Royal's argument, I'm completely prepared to believe he's got this just right, then it's all a question of speed of adoption. And industry, we've seen some mixed bag. Banking industry is adopted very quickly. Utility industries come way up the curve, particularly since the issues that surrounded Colonial Pipeline, which you and I spent a lot of time discussing when you were in office. But governments tend to be much slower adopters just because of budgetary processes and because it's government than the private industry. So does Royal's formula apply when you get to defending government systems?
So first, I very much agree with Royal's point that it's the deployment, it's the use of the technology. It's always far easier to attack than to defend. An attacker has to find one way in, a defender has to be monitoring every door and window. So it does start with that deployment question. So then coming to your question, David, which is, so when a president thinks about the security of national infrastructure, the likelihood of a cyber attack that disrupts critical services that Americans rely on, they think about water and power and those kinds of critical services. And I think what we see is making the adoption of new technologies like AI require investment, require attracting talent. And certainly we see it in some sectors, like banking. There's a significant opportunity to use AI to change the game for defense of some of the sectors that perhaps are a generation behind in technology, like water and pipelines. And as a result, there's a real incentive to deploy AI, but there's also real risks. How cyber secure are those AI models? So I think attracting talent into those sectors to feel that they can assess the cybersecurity of AI models and then deploy them in a safe way to have the game-changing impact is really the crux of where we want to go in terms of using AI for the cyber defense of the most critical national assets.
So to identify those areas and that territory, we've had a lot of people in private industry, many of them work for Royal, thinking out ahead about what you need to deploy. In the US government, there's been, I needn't tell you, Anne, from your days at NSA and your days at the White House, a lot of back and forth about who takes primary responsibility. I think you discovered in the examples you just gave, for pipelines, it was TSA. For hospitals, it's Health and Human Services, right? Everybody's got right, and some of them understand these issues, some don't. So it's worth then asking the question, are we following the right strategy inside the US government to be cutting so dramatically in places like CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which, if I read it right, is going to lose about 1/3 of its staff? I think that there are fewer cuts, at least proportionally, at your old shop at the NSA, but there's some as well. So how should we think about this? Is this just the wrong time to be cutting? Or, given the AI capabilities, is it the right time to be cutting and therefore using the technology in place of the people?
So it's never a good time when we lose talented cyber defenders in the US government, given the kinds of adversaries we're up against. With that said, as we've talked about, I think our approach to national cyber defense could use a reboot really driven by AI. What do I mean? You know, we would often, as we would look at specific threats, you know, Russia prior to its invasion of Ukraine, and we were concerned that as the United States put significant sanctions in place, Russia might respond with cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in the US or against our NATO allies. And when the president would ask, how secure are we, talking about critical pipelines or power, there wasn't a way to really measure and answer that. And I think what could be really interesting when we talk about a reboot of the way we approach national cyber defense is to say, can we train AI models on our most critical infrastructure, a digital twin of our power system, a digital twin of a large pipeline, to then test resilience against that and ensure that we're putting every dollar of cybersecurity investment to close holes that are most dangerous in terms of adversary capabilities. So I think to your point, it's never good to lose talent. I do think it's an opportunity to say, given AI, let's approach national cyber defense differently with a more targeted approach, using AI to close the holes in the most critical infrastructure where disruption would give an adversary a real way to coerce or put pressure, on US leadership.
So Royal, you get a chance to see this same problem from a different perspective. Many of the biggest hacks in the United States have been detected by your group, by Microsoft, by Apple, by others who have broad network view. Salt Typhoon was found in the private sector, not by the government along the way. So to your mind, are we losing much by shrinking down the government side of this? Does it play to your advantage? It's put a lot of great talent out on the market for you to go pick from.
Yeah, even as you're talking, I'm reminded why I came to Google. Before I was there, I spent 15, 20 years in financial services. And to this question, financial services had a rich and deep relationship with Treasury that started to work on cybersecurity questions. But it became clear that every aspect of society was going to be digitized, and you would see issues like we're just talking about. So coming to Google, I felt like was a chance to put bake security in from the beginning, but it is a complicated problem because the surface is growing as fast as we can protect the legacy technology. So there's a lot of ways to approach this, and it'll be interesting. We'll work with all the agencies as they work out their plans in this area. There's a role for private-public collaboration that I think has gotten better and better in the last 25 years. And we will continue to be at that table because the attack surface is growing while we sit here.
And tell us a little bit, Royal, about something that we all use, which is your Gmail team. I mean, you've got, I don't know how many billions of inboxes at this point.
Yeah.
But have you found in the course of your filtering there that you are staying ahead of the offense? Or do you think that the numbers of attacks and the scale that you've seen, just with the more primitive uses of AI so far, are beginning to overwhelm?
It's exactly the right question. We have been using AI to defend Gmail long before people were using chatbots, and it was one of our best use cases. And it's only gotten better. Let me just go a little bit into detail on it. We use little agents, little classifiers, to look at all the content and metadata about a message to look for bad actors. Mm-hmm. Historically, we had to write a bunch of rules and look for particular phrases or code. Now we're training that little agent or classifier with the Gemini model on the English policy of what fraudulent activity looks like. What does pig butchering look like as coming from a Southeast Asian country that's industrialized this? We're not writing those rules. We're letting the model understand and keep telling it, oh, this is a good example, that's a good example, here's the policy. And it gets us ahead of what any human could possibly do.
And Anne, as you traveled around the world, both in your job and since you've left the government, do you find the same focus on these issues here, abroad, that you find here?
Very much so. I think cyber has really become a key part of the geopolitical competition and crises. So for example, the South Koreans recently had a cyber attack very much akin to Salt Typhoon. half the country's citizens. They're identifying information, a telecom hacked, a sense that the attacker may have been in the telecom for quite some time. So certainly we see the same
and
kind of...
And just because of South Korea, just to make the point, Chinese, not North Korean, because the initial assumption in South Korea is almost always North Korea.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think the jury is still out for them, but given, for example, that the data that was stolen was not dumped, that's usually the idea of a criminal attacker who's trying to pressure the entity to pay a ransom of some kind. So given that it wasn't dumped, and given that it was a telecom and the mother lode of interesting espionage information, I think the sense that it's more likely the Chinese than North Korean. And as you know, just generally, the North Korean profile is a bit different. There's targeted theft to get around sanctions, and there's often hacking of weapons R&D to advance their military program. We see less compromise of critical infrastructure for just broad-scale intelligence when you look at the North Korean MO versus the Chinese one. But very much, you see countries around the world putting a real focus on saying, what are the most critical assets for us as a country, and what can we do to make the right investments to really harden those targets?
Just on that, I was going to chime in because I think I was in Japan and Taiwan a little bit before, it sounds like Ann was, and as everyone starts to think about how to use AI, and that hall is all full of it, right?
Right.
It's one thing for the model to tell you what it should do. It's another thing for it to take action. And so in manufacturing, in the warfare that you see out in the hall, every industry is going to rush to automate the last mile, because then the model can take action. It's not just telling someone what to do. Huge opportunity for us to secure that. Also big liability if we don't.
Right.
And I think countries around the world who have different industrial profiles are going to tackle this in different ways, and we need to be ready to help them.
And I think just to add a quick point to Royal's point, one of the key from a cybersecurity perspective, we've all been talking about identity. Know who's on your network, know the kind of rights they have, constrain that as much as possible. Building on Royal's excellent point, that was when we were only worried about humans on a network.
Agents.
As we have AI agents, it's really even more important that we have the identity and know the profile and the permissions of each of those to actually be able to leverage the very positive aspects of agents, but in a way that doesn't introduce new concerns.
I was thinking about your history, and we'll talk about this after, that my vision is that an agent could do the kind of compartmentalization work that we require in certain parts of the government better, because it tunes itself like that Gmail classifier, and it won't be the hassle to classify everything and everybody. You'll have a chaperone agent that will do it for you. That's the opportunity.
I wanted to conclude by talking a little bit about where this administration appears to be going. They haven't given an overall cyber vision yet, and your job, at least as it was constructed, Anne, in the old NSC, doesn't exist in the new NSC structure. But what little we have heard has been a discussion of how they want to go on the offense more, because they believe that our adversaries are not sufficiently concerned about retribution, that our deterrence has fundamentally failed. You heard a bit of this out at RSA. I think you were out there a month or so ago. But you've raised the point, great to go on the offense, but you got to make sure you have a pretty resilient defense if you're going to go do that, because it's not like the adversary is going to just sit around and turn the other cheek here. So give us a little bit of an update about where you think that debate is going on. And then Royal, I'm going to ask you whether or not you guys are preparing at Google for an era in which the US may be more on the cyber offense, and what you'd feel from that.
So there's certainly truth to the insight that US deterrence is not working in cyberspace. We see countries and criminals conducting attacks against US interests that they wouldn't do in a conventional space. whether that's criminals given haven by the Russian government disrupting hospital operations, some of the toughest issues we grappled with in the Biden administration, or whether that's countries like China, pre-positioning in critical infrastructure for potential sabotage in a future crisis or conflict. So I think it's right to say that our adversaries are not deterred in cyberspace in the way they are by our conventional military capabilities. And one reason in the past we have been very measured and careful, some might say hesitant, to use US offensive capabilities to deter countries or criminals, to have consequences for certain attacks, has been because of a concern that given our asymmetric vulnerability, a lot of connected infrastructure in the US, we could end up in a dangerous escalatory tit for tat where we would be in a harmful position at the end of that. I think that does need to change. We do need to build up our deterrence in cyberspace. We do need to use our offensive capabilities to do so. But we need to do certain things first. Specifically, I think as we talked about a bit earlier, I'd love to see us build digital twins of our critical infrastructure to have a good picture and a baseline of how vulnerable they are, to then drive resilience work and really focus our cybersecurity effort to plug the holes and make sure that if an adversary retaliated, we have a good picture of how resilient we would be and a way to rapidly increase our defenses as needed. So I think AI really gives an opportunity to change that deterrence picture in a very meaningful way.
Roy, we're just about out of time here, but your thoughts just quickly on how you prepare Google for that age.
Yeah, and as life is more and more digital, we're under no illusions that doesn't also include the battlefield in a broad sense. And I would say that the primary thing we are doing, we are doing everything to avoid a 2009 Project Aurora as the reason to go revamp. We're revamping the way we do security in the context of AI today, not waiting for an event to force us to do that.
Well, I want to thank you both. I could go on endlessly on this conversation, and we frequently all do, but I want to thank you for bringing us these insights. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.